At first glance, it may just look like another weed growing along a field edge. Over the course of a single growing season, a tiny seed can develop into a large branching annual covered in sharply toothed leaves that produce enormous trumpet-shaped flowers, and finally form these unmistakable spiny capsules containing hundreds of seeds. This is Datura Stramonium, commonly known as Jimsonweed or thorn apple, and is one of the most chemically fascinating members of the Nightshade family. And hidden throughout that plant is a mixture of tropane alkaloids capable of profoundly disrupting one of the most important neurotransmitter systems in the human body. So in this botanical episode, we're going to follow Datura Stramonium through its life cycle, look at its anatomy and physiology, examine where it grows and why it's become so successful around the world, break down the chemistry responsible for its toxicity, and finally look at some of its closest relatives, including the enormous angel's trumpet genus Brugmansia. And because this is Datura, an important warning before we continue. Every part of this plant should be considered poisonous. This video is meant to share botanical educational knowledge, not a guide to consume or prepare this plant. So with that out of the way, let's meet Jimsonweed. The genus name Datura has a long linguistic history. It is generally traced through South Asian names for plants, in this group particularly Sanskrit, Datura, with related forms eventually entering European botanical vocabulary. By the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus formally established Datura as the genus name in his 1753 species Plantarum. The specific epithet Stramonium has a less certain etymological history. Variations of the word were already being used for the plant in European herbals before Linnaeus standardized the modern binomial. But perhaps the more entertaining name is the common American name Jimsonweed. Jimsonweed is a contraction of Jamestown weed. The name became associated with an early colonial account from Jamestown, Virginia, describing soldiers becoming severely intoxicated after eating a plant identified historically as a species. Over time, Jamestown weed contracted into Jimsonweed, and eventually Jimsonweed. Other common names refer directly to its appearance. Thorn apple refers to the spiny fruit, and devil's trumpet refers to those enormous upward-facing flowers. The last name also gives us a convenient comparison with one of its relatives later in this episode, angel's trumpets in the Brugmansia genus. The species Datura Stramonium belongs to the kingdom Plantae in the order Solanaceae and the family Solanaceae, or Solanaceae, in the Datura genus. Solanaceae is the Nightshade family, which is an absolutely ridiculous family once you realize what humans have gotten from it. It contains tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplants, and tobacco, but it also contains some of the most famous poisonous plants in botanical history, including deadly nightshades like Atropa belladonna, henbane, which is Hyoscyamus niger, and Datura's Brugmansias, as well as several other varieties. Several of these lineages evolved the ability to manufacture tropane alkaloids, and Datura Stramonium is particularly good at it. Moving on to the plant itself, Datura Stramonium is usually an annual herb. A seed germinates, produces a seedling, rapidly develops a substantial vegetative body, flowers, produces seeds, and ultimately dies, completing its life cycle within a single growing season. Under favorable conditions, however, it can become surprisingly large. The stem becomes thick and highly branched, often with green, dark red, or purple coloration. One particularly characteristic feature is the repeated forking of the branches. At those forks, the plant begins producing its reproductive structures, the flowers. The leaves are simple rather than compound, usually broadly ovate, and have coarse, irregular teeth and lobes along the margins. They can become quite large, sometimes well over 6 to 8 feet tall, and a similar size wide, depending on the growing conditions. And if you've handled the plant, you may also notice that Jimsonweed has a rather distinctive smell akin to mushrooms, wet soil, or musty. Apparently producing neurotoxic alkaloids and carrying a medieval-looking seed capsule wasn't sufficient discouragement, so the plant also decided to smell questionable. Moving on to the flower, then we get to the most spectacular structure of this plant. Datura Stramonium produces large, solitary trumpet-shaped flowers that are normally held upright. The corolla is formed from fused petals and typically ranges from white to pale violet or purple. At the end of the trumpet, the corolla terminates in pointed lobes, producing that characteristic star-like outline when viewed from the front. Inside are 5 stamens surrounding the female reproductive structures. The ovary is superior, meaning it sits above the attachment point of the other major flower structures. Following successful pollination and fertilization, that ovary begins developing into something completely different, the thorn apple. Moving on to the fruits and seeds of the plant, the fruit of Datura Stramonium is not technically an apple, it's a capsule. As the fruit develops, its surface becomes covered in long, sharp projections. Initially, the capsule is green and fleshy. As the seeds mature, it dries and eventually turns brown. At maturity, the capsule splits open, typically along 4 valves, exposing numerous dark flattened seeds. And this reproductive strategy helps explain why a relatively small population of Jimsonweed can turn into a substantially larger population very quickly. A successful plant can produce multiple capsules, each containing large numbers of seeds. These seeds can then enter the soil seed bank and wait for appropriate conditions. For an annual plant living in disturbed environments, that's an extremely useful strategy. The individual plant doesn't need to survive the winter, its genetic lineage does. Moving on to ecology and habitat, that brings us to where Jimsonweed actually lives. Today, Datura Stramonium has an enormous global distribution. Current botanical treatments, generally regarded as a native to Mexico or the broader North American region, but humans and agriculture have helped spread it across much of the temperate and tropical and subtropical world. You can now encounter Jimsonweed across huge portions of North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and South America. But despite that enormous geographical range, its preferred habitat is remarkably consistent. Jimsonweed loves disturbance. Roadsides, field margins, waste grounds, construction sites, gardens, agricultural fields, and pastures. Anywhere vegetation has been disrupted and bare nutrient-rich soil becomes available. This makes Datura Stramonium what ecologists often call a ruderal species, a plant adapted to exploiting disturbed environments. Rather than investing heavily in permanent woody structures, it grows rapidly, becomes reproductive, produces large quantities of seeds, and completes its life cycle. And because the seeds can persist in disturbed soils, clearing vegetation can sometimes create exactly the conditions the next generation needs. Moving on to climate and growing season, although Datura Stramonium is associated primarily with warmer climates, its annual life history allows it to extend surprisingly far into temperate regions. It doesn't necessarily need to survive freezing temperatures as a mature plant. It only needs enough warm growing season to germinate, grow, flower, and produce mature seeds. The seeds then carry the population through unfavorable periods, and this is why the plant can occur in places with cold winters despite having subtropical origins. In warm conditions, with sufficient moisture and nutrients, growth can be extremely rapid. It also thrives in full sun and readily colonizes exposed soil. Its success, therefore, isn't because an individual Jimsonweed plant is indestructible, it's because its life history strategy is extremely good at exploiting temporary opportunities. Now, moving into the physiology and defense of this plant, we get into the really interesting part. Why does this plant contain such powerful chemicals in the first place? Well, in general, evolutionarily, plants can't run away from herbivores, so over hundreds of millions of years, plants have evolved physical and chemical defenses. Some manufacture irritating compounds, like in poison ivy, some produce cardiac glycosides, like in foxglove plants, some produce cyanogenic compounds, and several members of Solanaceae produce tropane alkaloids. For Datura Stramonium, the most important include hyoscyamin, atropine, and scopolamine, which was historically called hyoscine. These are nitrogen-containing secondary metabolites. Unlike compounds directly required for basic processes such as photosynthesis or cellular respiration, secondary metabolites frequently participate in ecological interactions, including defense. For an herbivore, eating a plant that profoundly disrupts normal nervous system functions is a fairly compelling lesson to not eat that plant again, assuming that herbivore survives the lesson in the first place. Now, the chemistry of Datura. The chemistry becomes even more interesting when we look at the structures of these molecules. Hyoscyamin, atropine, and scopolamine belong to the tropane alkaloids, named for the characteristic tropane skeleton found in their molecular structures. Hyoscyamin occurs naturally as a particular stereochemical form. Atropine is closely related. Chemically, atropine is the race mixture containing both enantiomeric forms of hyoscyamin. Scopolamine retains the tropane framework but contains an additional epoxide bridge which changes aspects of its pharmacological behavior. The plant doesn't distribute these compounds perfectly evenly. Alkaloid concentrations can vary between tissues, individual plants, developmental stages, and environmental conditions. That variability is extremely important when discussing Datura poisoning because it means there is no reliable visual way to determine how chemically potent a particular plant is. Two plants that look nearly identical can have different alkaloid profiles, and that makes attempting to estimate a safe amount of raw plant material fundamentally unreliable. Now, what these chemicals actually do. To understand Datura poisoning, we will need to talk about acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter used throughout both the central and peripheral nervous systems. One major class of acetylcholine receptors is called the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. Normally, acetylcholine binds to these receptors and activates them. Tropane alkaloids such as atropine and scopolamine interfere with that process. They act primarily as competitive antagonists of muscarinic receptors. Essentially, they occupy the receptors without activating it normally, preventing acetylcholine from producing its usual signal. And because muscarinic signaling is involved in so many physiological processes, blocking it doesn't produce one isolated symptom, it disrupts an entire network. This is called anticholinergic toxidrome. What Datura poisoning looks like. Well, peripheral antimuscarinic effects can include extremely dry mouth, reduced sweating, dilated pupils, blurred vision, and sensitivity to light, increased heart rate, reduced gastrointestinal movements, urinary retention, elevated body temperature, and flushed dry skin. They even made a rhyme for tropane alkaloid poisoning. But tropane alkaloids like hyoscyamin, atropine, scopolamine can also affect the brain, and this is where Datura becomes particularly dangerous. Central effects can include confusion, severe disorientation, memory impairment, agitation, and true delirium. Hallucinations can occur, but describing Datura simply as a hallucinogenic plant is misleading. This isn't necessarily comparable to the altered perception associated with classical stereotypic psychedelics. Severe anticholinergic intoxication can produce delirium in which a person may lose the ability to reliably distinguish internally generated experiences from external reality. They may interact with people or objects that aren't there, perform repetitive behaviors, become profoundly confused, and later have little or no memory of what even happened. Severe poisoning can progress to seizures, coma, dangerous cardiovascular effects, and death. So despite centuries of cultural fascination surrounding Datura, this is not a plant where unpredictable chemistry should be treated casually. Now the strange medical connection. Here's where the plant chemistry becomes wonderfully complicated. The molecules responsible for Datura's toxicity are not simply bad chemicals. Pharmacology depends on dose, formulation, route, and context. Atropine and scopolamine became medically important drugs precisely because scientists learned how to use their antimuscarinic properties in controlled doses. Atropine has important clinical applications, including treatment of certain forms of symptomatic bradycardia and poisoning involving excessive cholinergic activity. Scopolamine is used medically, particularly for prevention of motion sickness and post-operative nausea. So the same general class of molecules responsible for a potentially catastrophic plant poisoning can become useful medicines when purified accurately, measured, and administered for a specific pharmacological purpose. And that distinction is incredibly important. A pharmaceutical containing a known quantity of purified atropine is fundamentally different from consuming an unknown amount of plant tissue containing a variable mix of alkaloids. The molecule hasn't changed, our control over the dose has, and that is one of my favorite examples of why toxicology and pharmacology are inseparable. Now, Datura relatives. Datura Stramonium isn't alone. There are several recognized species within the Datura genus, and although they share the characteristic trumpet-shaped flowers and tropane chemistry, they can look dramatically different. For example, desert species like Datura rhydi or Datura noxia typically have broader, softer-looking foliage with conspicuous pubescence and larger white flowers. whereas Datura metal, what was thought to be an India native, has been cultivated extensively and includes some forms with enormous white, yellow, or purple flowers, including double and triple flowered ornamental varieties. Other species in the Datura genus include Datura discolor, Datura ferox, and Datura ceredicola. But there is another group that people frequently confuse with Datura, which is the Brugmansia genus. Now, Datura versus Brugmansia. At first glance, the confusion makes perfect sense. Both belong to Solanaceae, both produce enormous trumpet-shaped flowers, both contain the tropane alkaloids, and historically Brugmansia species were actually classified within the Datura genus. Today, however, botanists recognize them as separate genera. And once you know what you're looking for, they're surprisingly easy to distinguish. Datura species are generally herbs or relatively small shrubs that are frequently annual. The flowers are usually held upright, and their fruits are capsules frequently covered in spines that open to release their seeds. Brugmansia, on the other hand, consist of woody shrubs and small trees from tropical South America. Their enormous flowers usually point downward. Instead of the classic spiny dissonant Datura capsule, Brugmansia produces fleshy, smooth fruits that do not open in the same way at maturity. So there is wonderfully simple horticultural shorthand. Devil's trumpets, or Daturas, point its trumpets towards the sky, and angel's trumpets, or Brugmansias, hangs its trumpets towards the ground. One grows up from hell, while the other has blooms that fall from the heavens. Botanical common names apparently decided subtlety was unnecessary. And all this is why I find Datura Stramonium so fascinating. It's easy to dismiss as a poisonous weed, but when you actually study the plant, it connects an enormous number of botanical disciplines. Its rapid annual life cycle demonstrates adaptation to disturbed environments. Its global distribution shows how effectively plants can travel alongside human agriculture. Its flowers and fruits provide beautiful examples of reproductive morphology. Its alkaloids demonstrate chemical defense. Those same compounds connect botany directly with neurophysiology, toxicology, and medicine. Its relationship with Brugmansia, Hyoscyamus, Atropa, and the rest of Solanaceae in general provides a glimpse into the evolutionary history of one of the most chemically remarkable families of flowering plants. A seedling like this looks almost insignificant, but within a few months it can become a large reproductive plant producing flowers like those. Those flowers become these spiny capsules packed with another generation of seeds, and throughout that entire life cycle, the plant is running an extraordinary biochemical factory, assembling complex molecules that can alter mammalian physiology in astonishingly small quantities. That is Datura Stramonium, Jimsonweed, thorn apple, or devil's trumpet. A common weed, a globally successful colonizer, a historically important medicinal plant, a dangerous poison, and one seriously fascinating member of the Nightshade family. And that's exactly why sometimes the most interesting botanical specimens aren't hidden deep inside some untouched wilderness. Sometimes they're growing in a patch of disturbed dirt right beside you. I hope you enjoyed this botanical episode of this nightshade species, Datura Stramonium. If you want to get updated on any botanical content I posted, just feel free to subscribe. I'll try to update close to every Friday, every other week. Thanks for watching.